Welcome, HDSB families, students, and community members. Thank you for joining us at the first session of this year's Directors Panel series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land. We begin by acknowledging the land and our responsibility to care for and respect for all that provides us with life. This land upon which HDSB is situated is on the ancestral treaty and tidal lands of the Anishinaabeg, Ojibwe, Michizagig Nation, now known as the Mississaugas of the Credit. Michizagig territory in the past and present continues to host both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. The HDSB is committed to continuous knowledge building with respect to actions that address and resolve the ongoing impacts of colonialism. We do this by learning and understanding the true history, treaty obligations, duties and responsibilities, and Indigenous rights, while actively maintaining mutually beneficial relationships and collectively respecting and caring for the land. This Directors Panel series began a few years ago, and each year we're excited to bring it back as it's a great opportunity to share with and hear from our community and explore issues and themes impacting students and impacting education today. The theme of tonight's session is Building Bridges in a Polarizing World, and we'll be discussing some of the ways in which we can lead with respect and understanding as we navigate conversations around diverse perspectives. We'll also explore how we can hold space for opposing ideas to develop mutual respect and understanding of each other as we forge a way forward together. Here with us this evening as our feature panelist is Dr. Stephen Katz, Professor of Applied Psychology and Human Development at the Ontario Institute for Studies of Education at the University of Toronto. And we're really excited to have Dr. Katz join us for this discussion as he brings extensive expertise in the areas of cognition and learning, evidence-informed decision-making, and for school improvements and leaderships for system change. And we're also joined this evening by Director of Education for the HDSB, Curtis Ennis, and Human Rights and Equity Advisor, Pardeep Nagra. And as a reminder to all those watching live, this is an interactive session, so please remember that you can submit questions live through the Google form, and that Google form is embedded in the description of the YouTube video for this live stream. We won't be able to get to all the questions this evening, but we will aim to get to as many as possible. And this session will be recorded and made available for viewing afterwards as well on the HDSB website. So at this time, I'm happy to turn things over to Director Ennis.
Thank you so much, Heather, and good evening, everyone. Welcome once again to the Directors Panel series. Happy to have you with us, Stephen. I hope I can call you Stephen, right?
You can absolutely call me Stephen. Thanks, Curtis. Great to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Stephen, we want to kick things off. Certainly, I think there is a general consensus in society today that there seems to be a divide and a greater polarization that's taking place in society, where folks are sort of shouting across the fence at each other, but not listening to each other. And so the conversation is not taking place, but there is a lot of, sort of shouting and drowning out voices. So wondering how, we can create the space or the conditions, or what conditions need to be necessary for us to really listen to each other so that we can move forward, even if we disagree.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question and, of course, share the observation. It is a global phenomenon, and it plays out in all of the micro and macrocosm spaces in which we work. I think that from my perspective, I'm a firm believer in the best way of thinking about what a productive way forward is to understand the problem better. The psychologist in me will always lean into what we think about as the problem identification phase. And the problem identification phase really asks us to actually understand how polarities work. And then from there, think a little bit about what it actually means for each and every one of us to take responsibility for thinking about how to move beyond them. My theme from the perspective of creating conditions is actually one that is already an intentional interruption for the way that some of these sort of polarities unfold. And that's by asking each of us to look in the mirror at ourselves before we try and look out the window to have the conversation with others. So I think it does start with a dimension or an aspect of self-awareness. And the self-awareness part of understanding, from a problem identification perspective, what's at the heart of these kinds of polarities is really an understanding of how, in fact, they form. And there are a couple of really insidious, what we would like to call in the literature, cognitive biases. They are biases or errors in the way that we think about things. One of which is well known as the binary bias. And the binary bias, by definition, takes complex issues off of a continuum and creates two polar opposites. So it takes a continuum where there is a continuum of gray, if you will, and reduces to black and white. Now, when you take gray and reduce it to black and white, you automatically go to the extreme ends of the continuum, the lightest and the darkest, for example. And that creates a oppositional dynamic where there is this either or. And the more you find yourself living in the world of either or, the more entrenched you become in those positions. And in fact, you get pushed further to the extremes of those positions because there is no concept of a continuum. That's a bias that our minds create for us. And it comes up with things like, I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, I'm principled, you're devoid. These are the kinds of ways that plays out from the, hypothetically speaking. I should have flipped it around and used myself in the other example, Curtis. I think you might be on mute.
Yeah, no, thank you. So that's wonderful. That's a great start. So you talk about that bias. So again, do we all come to the table with some form of bias, or some folks will talk about being bias free, or they don't have biases. What are your thoughts on that?
So there is a bias that is colloquially known as the I'm not biased bias. That's actually a bias. The technical term for it is illusory superiority. I like to refer to it as the I'm a legend in my own mind bias. But it really is the I'm not biased bias. It is the bias that makes us believe that the issue is with other people who may in fact come with these biases, but not ourselves. That actually is in and of itself a bias.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Stephen. Heather, I'm wondering if you let's just jump right to a question from the public.
For sure. We're getting a lot of questions about polarization, which, Stephen, you're speaking to. Specifically, how would you define polarization, and what are some of the main causes? What are the consequences? And is there any good to polarization?
So as I mentioned before, the causes are very much entrenched in these biases. And I'll just continue by sharing with you a little bit about how it works. So something like the binary bias will force us to the poles of positions and take something off of a continuum and make it into an either or. But that's not all that happens, because once you are pushed out to the pole of a particular position, there's another bias that takes hold, and that's called the confirmation bias. And that's the bias where we look really, really hard to confirm and affirm what we already think, believe, know, and do. So you are pushed out to the pole of a position, and then you look for confirmation. You troll through the environment looking for confirmation to confirm and affirm what you already think, believe, know, and do. And you do that not only in the world, but also through the relationships and through who your conversation partners are. So what ends up happening is you create almost like an echo chamber. You create an echo chamber of like-mindedness. And then you say, oh, look, I found people who agree with me. But we created that very echo chamber ourselves. And then we say, see, look, I found it. And if you're asking me like what contributes to it, like social media does us no favors from the perspective of creating echo chambers where algorithms push us into like-minded spaces. And the fundamental interruption of polarities is the ability to actually open up our own minds, and in doing so, allow us to engage with others so that we can open up one another's minds. And that is a very, very difficult thing to do if we don't actually put ourselves into contact with any opposing, diverse, different ways of thinking, opinions, and perspectives. We will just keep cycling around in those independent echo chambers. And the more you cycle around them, the more entrenched it becomes.
Well, it's interesting, Stephen, you were talking about open mind, because I know there was a question from the community that came out to kind of say, and maybe if you want to expand on that, when it was asked, how do you then keep an open mind? And you're sharing a little bit, and I think if we go explore that a little bit further, because if you're saying that that's one of the responsibilities we have when we're talking about ourselves and looking in and our biases and ourselves not getting to those points of the ends and what's required of us. And so do you want to kind of just share out a little bit more around that concept of open mind and how is that built? And
absolutely, Pardeep, I'm happy to. I think one of the things that becomes super important in that space is actually understanding why in which we actually want to value an open mind. And that has to be because our defined success criteria is about shared problem solving. And I want to just use an example or an analogy here. There's a psychologist by the name of Phil Tetlock who does all kinds of interesting work around some decision-making work. And one of the things that he talks about is how all of us will come to a challenging conversation through a series of lenses that look like jobs, even though they're not our jobs. And what he talks about, for example, is there are many times when we might find ourselves in a preacher stance. And a preacher stance is a stance where we come with an ideology, and we feel that our goal as a preacher is to get others to subscribe to the ideology that we have. So the success there is not about saying, how do we engage in collaborative problem solving? It's about saying, how do I get people to believe what I believe? So if my goal is to get other people to believe what I believe, I'm not really all that interested in opening up my own mind from that perspective. I can also come to the encounter or the conversation as a prosecutor. If I come as a prosecutor, my job is to win. And if my job is to win, the way I win is by ensuring you lose. I'm right, you're wrong. And so again, I'm not looking for collaborative or constructive problem solving. I'm looking to win, right? And so if you just think about those two stances and you think about how many of our challenging conversations feel like we're in those things, like those aren't our jobs. We're not preachers and we're not prosecutors, but there's lots of times when our most challenging conversations feel like we're in those things. But I go back to the success criterion being about problem solving or finding a way forward, because as a good friend of mine was fond of saying, and he's no longer with us, being right isn't a strategy. Being right might feel good, and being right might actually be something that is valuable if you're a prosecutor or a preacher. But if you are trying to solve challenging and complex problems in the world that we live in, and try, for example, to figure out how we can actually stay in dialogue with each other in challenging spaces, we have to recognize that being right isn't going to help us do that. If me being right and you not willing to talk to me doesn't actually help us make the world a better place at all. So the idea of creating open-mindedness or active open minds is really premised on this understanding is that it really isn't functional or particularly helpful to want to be right or to want to win if it doesn't actually help us move forward in the collective space.
Thank you so much for that. Heather, let's go to another question.
What are some solutions to polarization, Stephen?
I So listen, the first thing I'm going to say is it's really difficult. Okay. So this is not easy, because one of the things that I think we also need to understand is that we are talking now in a way that is very much driven by a cognitive framing of the challenge, where we are not attending to the emotional dimension of the challenge. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt has a really nice analogy that, many of you will be familiar with, where he talks about the rider and the elephant, and you've got this giant elephant that is representative of the emotions that we bring. It is where we get our power and our passion from. The rider is our cognition, the rational thinking part that sits on top of the elephant, that for the most part does a reasonably good job of trying to kind of set a direction and steer the elephant. But you never forget that the elephant is right there beneath you. And when the elephant wants to be an elephant, it kind of doesn't care what the rider wants or doesn't want. Which means that, I even though we are having a very intellectual conversation here, most of our challenging examples of polarities are ones that are very, very emotionally charged. And that's also why I really subscribe to this notion of looking in the mirror before the window, is because I need to get in touch with my own emotions before I can hope to engage you around your own. And sometimes engaging with my own emotions, the elephant is just running too wild for me to do that right now. So the move for me is actually not to engage with you in that space where it is very fresh and very deep and very raw. As a psychologist, I do subscribe to the functional view of emotions. Emotions exist to tell us something is important. They don't exist to get in the way of our lives. So we do need to listen to ourselves around what that's all about. But I do think it's helpful in something we call perspective seeking, because if I am able to think about how things feel for me, it helps me start to begin to get a sense of how things could feel for you. I can't feel what you feel. And we have to rid ourselves of that misconception. I can't take your perspective, but I can seek your perspective. I can want to know how something feels to you because I know how something feels to me. And that becomes a really important part for beginning this concept of what it means to be willing to engage with one another.
So, Stephen, something interesting as part of my portfolio as well, and we think about some of the things, even in our multi-year strategic plan, we talk about equity and inclusion, right? And when we're talking about it sometimes even feels that we can never come up with that language where in of itself creates this concept of or feeling of polarization, right? And so, for example, when we're talking about polarization and bridges, what does it look like and feel like if we're trying to frame it through a concept of inclusion, right? Because sometimes people are saying, well, how could you include me if I don't believe? And I know the Supreme Court of Canada, in terms of one of the documents we reference, the Ontario Human Rights Creed policy talks about Supreme Court of Canada concept of cognitive dissonance, right? And that it's almost necessary for us when we're thinking about these pieces of being and coming from a concept of difference into space, right? What would you think about that? And then I do want to come back around Heather's question around is there any good, not necessarily in polarization, but coming with difference, right? Or difference of opinion. So, but I want to kind of speak to that whole piece around inclusion, right? Because inclusion doesn't necessarily mean everybody's going to be equal or what have you.
No, and in fact, one of the biggest challenges is, that cognitive dissonance or, a feeling of mental discomfort is actually a necessary prerequisite for new learning. It's not an unfortunate consequence. It feels like an unfortunate consequence, but it's actually an essential prerequisite. There is no concept of real, true new learning. And in psychology, we define real new learning as a permanent change in knowledge and behavior. And by permanent change, I mean It doesn't mean you can't, change and then grow further, but it does mean you don't go back to the way you were thinking about things a week later or a month later or a year later or when the exam is over. So real learning is actually a permanent change in thinking and behavior. It means the way you think and the way you behave will never be the way it was before for it to truly meet the definition of learning. And the only way you get from one space to another in your understanding is by first creating a disturbance. And that's a mental disturbance. And that is the idea of cognitive dissonance. You need that mental discomfort or the mental disturbance. Now, at the time, it actually doesn't feel very good, but it's actually a sign that something is right. And diversity of opinion and difference in thought is actually the raw material for building new ideas. You can't get to a new plateau of understanding if you don't have new raw material to use to build a new understanding. You're just going to live in the lowest common denominator of agreement, and it's not going to help move us forward at all. So, in fact, when you look at the literature on something that we call the wisdom of crowds, which is how are groups of people able to make us collectively all smarter or better, yes, we have, the concept of, being independent in our thinking, but the idea is diversity of opinion aggregated together actually truly does create an opportunity for us to come up with ways of thinking and doing and knowing that none of us actually had alone. And so if we get back to what you had asked me before around this idea of, open-mindedness, there is actually like a cognitive feature of individuals that's described as active open-mindedness. And there are actually almost like tests or assessments for getting a sense of the extent to which people are open-minded. And just to give you the kind of example of the questions that people would answer in the affirmative to, that would be a signal of being open-minded. One would be, for example, the statement, people should take into consideration evidence that goes against my own beliefs. That means you're open-minded. Or it's more useful to pay attention to people who disagree with me than people who agree with me. If I answer yes to those kinds of things, those are indicators of my ability to be open-minded, because those examples of places where and I use the term recruit contradictory evidence, I actually go out there looking to try to prove myself wrong, because that's how you stress test the limits of your understanding. When you put yourself into a place where you seek out disconfirming evidence or alternative opinions, that actually creates an opportunity for the raw material for new understanding. So difference isn't a problem to solve. It's actually an essential condition for new learning and growth. But the discomfort is absolutely going to be a part of it. Not an unfortunate consequence, an essential prerequisite.
So if I may follow up on that, thank you for that, Stephen. In my position as director, you can imagine I get a variety of opinions coming at me on any different issue at the same time. And, whether it's, the Board of Trustees get the same thing as constituents reach out to them, seniors team get the same thing. So we get a myriad of ideas and perspectives and opinions coming at us. And I want to focus on the concept of listening, because folks will then say, well, you're not listening to me, or you didn't listen to me because you didn't do what I asked you to do, or you didn't do what I say. So this whole idea of listening, is there what does the literature say around listening in particular? And how can I still be a listener if I don't agree with everything I've heard? As you spoke about that aggregation of the data of listening.
Yeah, that's a great question, Curtis. So you're absolutely right. Sometimes listening is used as a proxy, and being heard is used as a proxy for doing what I want you to do. So, what you typically get is, I will say I don't feel heard, but what I mean is you're not doing what I want. And that isn't the same thing. We talk about the concept of active listening, and active listening means that individuals or groups feel heard. Now, the extra step where feeling heard equates to doing what I want is actually something that we have to interrupt by actually defining what the success criteria for active listening is beforehand. So not after somebody has already shared and then you don't do what they're asking for and then they say you didn't listen to me. When you establish the conditions on the front end for engaging in conversation, because one of the really important pieces around how you proceed beyond polarities is by building the ramp for those conversations before, not when you're in the middle of them. It's very difficult to actually call some kind of a timeout and want to create process and protocol when you're in the middle of something. So part of developing a set of shared understandings on the front end of what it means to be in dialogue with each other is actually defining what constitutes listening. And so what constitutes listening is I will do my absolute best to ensure that you will feel heard. The way you will feel heard is through my ability to paraphrase what I'm hearing you saying, and for you to tell me if what I'm hearing you say is what you mean. It doesn't mean that I will be able to do what you want or that I will even necessarily agree with you. So if I actually define that on the front end, then I am able to create an opportunity where we're not using different success criteria for what it means to feel listened to or to feel heard. And the idea of active listening, sometimes even called persuasive listening, is something that we can practice in our leadership spaces through paying attention to what we call, and Adam Grant does a nice treatment of this in his book, the paying attention to our question to statement ratio. So do we ask more questions than make statements? That's a good indicator of listening. Is, am I asking more questions or am I making more statements?
Okay, Heather, let's get to some more of those community questions.
Sounds good. If you feel passionately about an issue, how do you express it, or how should we without stepping on others' toes? That's a question that we just got.
So again, I'm going to come back to the theme of mirrors before windows, right? And so, even the sensitivity of understanding, what it feels like for you to feel passionately, hopefully helps you to understand that someone else might also feel passionately about something that's different than what you do, right? So certainly, that perspective seeking dimension, I think, becomes quite important in that kind of a space. For me, one of the things that I try to do myself a lot is to use what we call I statements, where I am clearly looking to communicate and share that those passions belong to me. They aren't a universal truth that you are just failing to see because you're not as smart as I am, for example, but it's an issue of perspective. So I think for me, people will always use words for me like, well, what's the objective truth? And I have a definition of objectivity that feels a little slippery, but it really works for me. And I've always defined objectivity as declaring my subjectivity. That's the best I can do. Objectivity for me is declared subjectivity. So I will use an I statement and declare my subjectivity around something to make it clear that it's a perspective. And in doing so, I will invite you into the conversation and ask you to use an I statement to define objectivity for you as declared subjectivity. And I do think, and I do want to say that there is, and this goes back to something Pardeep mentioned earlier, there does need to be like a common foundation that unites us around the concept of something like collaborative problem solving or an awareness of the value of difference and diversity, which really at its core is human rights from my perspective. And one of the things that, I found enormously helpful in my own learning around this, and I know I've shared this with a couple of you before, is the extent to which I am not so intimately wedded to a specific idea that idea becomes synonymous with who I am. Because if that idea becomes or perspective becomes synonymous with who I am, there is no opportunity for me to even engage in a rethinking. There's some good wisdom in the notion that our identities, and I'm going to refer here to professional identities as an example, are best constructed around a set of core values, not specific ideas, because we will be reluctant to let go of ideas if they are at the heart of our professional identity. We will be much more likely to open them up to scrutiny and growth and challenge if our professional identities are constructed around values. So, for example, many of you in the education community know about the work that we're engaged in to move towards the science of reading and structured literacy in ways that have been sort of directed through the OHRC's Right to Read report as an example of an important piece of work on ensuring that and understanding that reading is a fundamental human right. It has asked us to rethink some of our ideas and practices around how to teach reading. Now, if my professional identity is built around a specific way to teach reading, I am going to be loath to want to let that go. If, however, my professional identity is built around the value of reading as a human right, then I am willing to update my ideas, try new things, engage in alternative methodologies or practices, because my value is fundamentally based on reading as a human right. So yes, I did it through a balanced literacy approach because that's the best evidence we had. Now we're thinking about structured literacy, but I don't feel like I'm losing who I am as a professional because it's value-based, not practice or idea-based in that space.
Stephen, that's interesting, and probably want to continue that conversation on two parts because we've had a number of questions come out around these two themes. We've had a number of educators saying, what can I do in my classroom, or what are some strategies that you might want to share for us to kind of work towards that concept of building bridges, right? Because students and families and even world events or even local events can come and students can come into our classrooms and are in our classrooms with differences, different viewpoints. And so what's almost that teacher facilitator role in terms of the building bridges? And equally on another softer level, we have a number of parents who are excited about this topic and kind of want to know the same thing around some strategies that we might apply at home around this conversation.
Yeah, and again, so there is a lab at Columbia University run by a psychologist called Peter Coleman, and the lab is known as the Difficult Conversations Lab. And the Difficult Conversations Lab actually exists to study difficult conversations and to actually create conditions for what it looks like to engage in dialogue around difficult conversations. One of the things that comes out as a almost universal finding in all difficult conversations is that they start with two words. It's complicated. It's complicated. It feels like a cop-out. But I think immediately by actually defining the concept and framing it as it's complicated, is already an intentional interruption of the binary bias that suggests that we are going to come out of this with some kind of singular answer where there's a right or a wrong or a yes or a no or a go or a no-go. So for me, like when I actually think about a little bit of a methodology for how to proceed beyond these polarities, and this would apply in a classroom, it would apply at home, it would apply in the boardroom, or in an executive council space, or quite frankly anywhere. From the perspective of a little bit of a methodology. First of all, the value of developing and applying guiding principles. And again, I want to come back to the point that you can't do these things in the moment or in the middle. They are part of constructing a culture and building a ramp to being able to do this, whether it's in a classroom, a boardroom, or a meeting room. So developing and applying guiding principles so that in the moment, when you are making decisions about who speaks, how they speak, how you engage, you are applying some predetermined guiding principles, not just making it up on the spot, where then some people feel like you're taking sides or there's winners or losers. Also, designing and implementing effective processes, being really process strong in the way in which you do these. Are we going to use protocols for forcing us to listen to each other because we know that's not something we do naturally well? If we're going to talk about the value and utility of using protocols for difficult conversations, we have that as part of strong process, and we use it and we implement it when we do these kinds of things. We assume an open to learning stance. And again, we have examples of what it actually means to be in an open to learning stance through things like active listening. We lean in towards complexity. So we actually take the poles and locate them on a continuum of gray, where we understand things like nuance and context. And we talk about those specifically. And our coalitions are diverse. So in other words, we actually recognize that our goal isn't to try to figure out how to land with one form of a universal truth. So like just those 5 things as an example are sort of 5 things that we can do on the front end as part of a ramp building to create cultures where that kind of thing happens. So, when you're thinking about a particular classroom, we use the phrase classroom culture a lot, right? That would be an example of the investment we make in classroom culture. So my biggest message on this from both the literature and my own research and experience is like, this isn't a place to fly by the seat of one's pants. There's too much elephant in this to be able to do that, So that's why, the value of the front end is really worthwhile.
I want to get to some more questions, Heather, but I have a burning question, Stephen. You talked about a little bit about, creating things on the front end. You've referenced that a few times. And also you spoke about, to that end, creating culture. How easy or difficult is it to create a culture where we can have those shared understanding?
Difficult. Like most things that are worth doing, it's difficult. I do spend a lot of my time, and you know this well, in spaces of organizational change and system improvement. It's where I do most of my work. And I can absolutely tell you, and the literature supports me, that culture change is the hardest kind of work in an organization. Culture change is really, really tricky. It's very, very difficult. And it's, notoriously hard, but massively worthwhile. It definitely can be done. We have lots of evidence to suggest that it can be done. It's just not easy. It doesn't happen quickly. And it's not always smooth. In fact, almost never is. But it's entirely worthwhile to be able to do it, for sure, from that perspective. So doable, yes. Worth it, yes. Easy, no.
All right, Heather.
We've received a question that says, real world current events and the classroom. What is the process to choose whether it's A, discussed in the classroom, and B, how detailed to dive into the issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, it's one, I think all of us get this one a lot. And then there's also the question about, is there space for the personal opinion of the educator or the adult in the room if we're in a classroom of younger kids as an addition in that space? I get to default to, my difficult conversation answer. It's complicated. But there are absolutely certainly ways to be able to do this. So first of all, the developmentalist in me would suggest respecting the developmental expertise of what it means for readiness to be able to have certain conversations. So there is a developmental continuum by which, kids of particular ages are able to grasp and not grasp certain kinds of things. Things that you can understand when you are 17 are not understandable when you are 7. I understand there's lots of room for individual difference in there, but there are some predictable pathways in development. It is fairly gradual, it is fairly staged, and it's fairly predictable. So there is an aspect of readiness to be able and willing to engage in certain things for sure. And so for me, that in many ways is a prerequisite for whether or not we go there. There are also places where part of looking in the mirror as the educator in the space is asking ourselves whether we have the emotional bandwidth to be able to facilitate that kind of a conversation in the right here, right now. Not that we should say we can never, because I think that is a responsibility for us as educators to be able to do. But there's a very big difference when the emotions are fresh and raw and heightened, and I need to know myself well enough to self-regulate my ability to be able to do that. I did that in my own classroom with adults, with graduate students not that long ago, where, I stood in front and I said, I know there's a lot that we need to talk about. I'm just not ready to do that with you today, but we will. And so I said that as a way of saying, it's not that I don't think we should, and it's not that I don't think that it's important. I just don't think I can do that with you today. That happened to be the next day. So I just can't do that right now, but we will. When we make the decision to go there, we then set the preconditions I was sharing earlier that Curtis referenced about building the ramp on the front end to be able to do that through the kinds of, some people call them norms. I really like this idea of shared understandings, but the shared understandings are only as good as our ability to actually implement and regulate with them. Sometimes what we do is we establish a set of shared understandings at the beginning, but then of course we just forget about them. And so it's really important that we are active in the application of them throughout that kind of space. So I guess when you wrap all of that up together, and tie a knot around it, you can label it as it's complicated, right? Because that's a complicated process. It's not easy, but it's worthwhile, I think. And then of course, not being afraid to reach out for help and help in facilitating those kinds of conversations in those ways.
If I may jump in quickly, Heather, I know I want to get to as many questions as possible. Stephen, the whole issue, you referenced human rights earlier around right to read. That's one where I think most people can coalesce around and galvanize towards, in a shared understanding and values of society. But there are other, grounds in the human rights code that, we can't get that same level of shared understanding. Sexual identities, sexual identities and expressions, religion, race, creed, you name any of the other grounds, and you almost definitely find people going to those polarized ends that you talked about earlier. So, do we take a position? What's your position on the human rights grounds in terms of conversation, polarity, and push and pull that we experience as boards?
So It's a non-negotiable from my perspective. I don't want this to sound like, from my perspective, that it's an anything goes, choose your own adventure version. We have a responsibility in an education space, and human rights is a set of values, and it's codified in law for a reason. If you want to change that, you can go be a lawyer and figure out how to put yourself in front of the Supreme Court and argue for a human rights change. I don't believe that our responsibility as educators is to adjudicate the value of human rights. I take that as an absolute given. Many of you, my position, that I believe education, and particularly public education, is a giant intervention. It's designed to interrupt the perpetuation of systemic inequities. And I do believe that there is a place for everybody who fundamentally subscribes to those shared sets of values. Now, what I do want to say, so for me, things that are codified in law, for example, do need to be treated like that. They're not I think I'll just opt out. It doesn't work like that. Us being really clear. And again, when I said earlier that for me, the idea of developing and applying guiding principle number one is that we are fundamentally informed and driven by human rights. So applying the guiding principle doesn't say, well, then, I can decide whether or not I want to suspend it in the particular time or space. It's taken as such. The guiding principle is that when we're making a tough decision, it will always be grounded in human rights value and in human rights legislation. And I think it needs to be, from my perspective, in that way. Now, what you're sharing is what happens when there isn't agreement on some of those dimensions, right? And this is where it comes to what I said earlier about being right isn't going to be a strategy, because you're never going to open up someone's mind by saying to you, well, that's the law, too bad if you don't like it. That's not going to get them to come around. So the question then is, what does it actually look like to engage them in that conversation and kind of engage them in the space? And that's where everything that I've said already applies, from the perspective of creating an opportunity to open minds of both ourselves and others. But that doesn't mean that we are okay with throwing human rights law away. It doesn't mean we're okay with creating or allowing harm and hate and all of the things that we have laws for. They exist for a reason, and they're not up for adjudication from my perspective, and I don't think from many others as well.
Thank you for that, Heather.
Someone's asked, Stephen, are there any classes or programs that you would recommend where individuals can learn and practice these communication skills that you've touched on?
There's a lot of interesting things that you could read for sure, about, the suite of cognitive biases that get in the way of making it easier for us to rethink things. One of my own books, Intentional Interruption, gets at that from an education and professional learning perspective. Adam Grant has a really good book called Think Again, and it's all about, the opportunity to create conditions to rethink certain things. Many of the things I've shared this evening, you would find reflected in there. One of the things that's challenging in the space is it's not always easy to learn about these things in a vacuum. We know that the best learning, professional learning, is just in time, job embedded, and needs based. And so it does need to be kind of integrated into the fabric of the organizational space from that perspective. The Difficult Conversations Lab has some really interesting resources for thinking and understanding how to do that. As do like a whole bunch of different agencies, quite frankly, that can be quite helpful in that space. But it all maps back onto an open to learning stance, because you have to want to be able to do that, right? And so that's actually the most important intentional interruption strategy, is an awareness that you actually want to do this and need to do this. It kind of gets you almost halfway there, at least, simply, we are all here having this conversation, and just the ability that we've chosen to opt into this conversation is already probably the most powerful of those strategies.
Can we get another one?
How do we start? I do, yes. How do we start conversations in the classroom when some want open dialogue, but others claim the same open dialogue is a threat?
So, again, I'm going to come to guiding principles again, right? So if I have a guiding principle that is do no harm, then it's not okay. I don't think I don't think it's okay for us to create harm, it cannot be an anything goes environment, right? Now, again, it's very hard to establish a do no harm principle in the middle of it. We have to establish the do no harm guiding principle and be process strong around it before. Then we get to point to where it says it on the wall of our shared understandings in the moment and refer out to the third point, because otherwise it's a contest of wills, instead of referring out to the third point as the guiding principle from that perspective. People absolutely, and it is certainly the case for parents to make decisions about the kinds of things that their children will and won't be part of. But we have a set of commitments in public education that are formulated in our guiding principles, and upholding essential human rights. Again, I'll go back to what I said before. Those things are non-negotiables, but they're not non-negotiables because it's what I'm saying, with an ideology, and I want to be right and you're wrong. It's a foundational understanding that we're accepting as defining the limits of the space, right? But that's the case for everything we do in the world. You just can't do whatever you want, however you want, in everything, all the time, everywhere, with all kinds of cost and harm to other people. That's not the world we live in, and it's okay for us to be able to set some limits around that. So while I'm a fundamental believer in an open to learning stance around this, it's not an anything goes learning stance. Or an open to learning stance doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean you can create harm. It doesn't mean you can do harm and call it learning. It doesn't work like that. So having, from my perspective, some clear, non-negotiables that we can call, I prefer foundational understandings, core commitments, and being really, really clear about those things. Those things don't need to be, those things don't need to be inquired around. They're taken as givens through the fundamental mission of what it means to be in public education.
And I know we're coming down to the last few minutes. I'm going to ask one more question before, Pardeep, I guess, have a final question for you, or Heather. How hopeful are you, Stephen, that we can get to a place of shared understanding and less polarity in our society?
I have to be hopeful. I have to be hopeful, and I am. I'm not overly Pollyanna to the point where I'm not going to say that I feel like we're probably in the most divided time that we've ever been in. And again, I feel it is massively exacerbated by things like social media. I think the value of what we do in education is our only hedge against moving beyond problematic polarities, helping people understand what it means to land in an echo chamber that you didn't even realize you were in. So, we almost think about some of these things as, preventative measures, or, in some ways they are an inoculation against some of the things that happen to us without our realizing it. I absolutely believe that we hold the pen and have the agency in terms of getting beyond this, and helping to move away from it. But I would be lying if I didn't say that it's really, really difficult. But I think that we are the only hope to be able to navigate our way through it. And we understand it enough to be able to do that.
Thank you for that, Party. You're on mute.
Oh, Party, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I think it's timely in terms of the last question that Director Ennis had asked you, and part of your closing words that gives us continued hope as a school board, and about the pen and the agency, and I think this conversation hopefully is just another step for us as a system to continue to engage in both dialogue and our responsibility, and be that hope for people. I've often said that we have to be that example of what it means, where people could come together coming from different regions of the world, coming together having differences of ideas and opinions, coming together from different creed practices, and many other differences around identity and viewpoints. And so I want to thank you for being with us to facilitate, as you mentioned many times, a very complex discussion and challenge and issue that we have, but knowing that we leave with hope. And I think that's one of the most important pieces for us tonight. And if we continue as parents, as community, as educators, as staff, to take some of the messages you said, which is the first message you started us off with, about the mirror and looking at ourselves, and asking us for those things that you touched upon around, have we created our own echo chambers? Have we created our own confirmation biases in terms of how we're engaging both ourselves and engaging with others? I think are powerful things for us to take back in all the different aspects that we live in our lives, and especially for us in our role as educators. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Heather for helping facilitate all the questions from community. And as you mentioned, we weren't able to and won't be able to answer all of them, but really appreciate those as well. And obviously the leadership of Director Ennis and this Director's Lecture Series, which gives us a chance to engage in conversations that are not only important around us, but to us. And so with those words, I want to thank everybody for participating, taking part, and being part of listening tonight, and look forward to other opportunities as part of other series that we're going to have as part of the Director's Lecture Series. So thank you very much.
And as we have a few more seconds before we sign off, thank you, Party, for those words. I want to thank Stephen and Heather, Kevin and Amy behind the scenes, and thanks to everyone. I want to thank the Board of Trustees, the senior staff, and all the staff of the HDSB for the great work that you're doing. I was in a school today, and the theme was kindness. And I just want to leave with those words. Let's be kind to each other. Students to students, staff to students, parents to parents, different identities to different identities, regardless of what space you occupy. Let's be kind to each other. I think if we start there, we can accomplish a lot. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.